Jesus reveals life before Adam, before Eden, before the first name humanity was taught to remember. Jesus spoke of a beginning that was deliberately erased. In the first moments of this video, understand this clearly. The creation story most people know is not false, but incomplete. And what is missing is the key to understanding why the world feels fractured, why humanity lives with a quiet sense of exile, and why freedom feels like a distant memory rather than a natural state. Jesus revealed that life did not begin in limitation. Limitation came later. The pre-Adamic world was not symbolic, mythical, or poetic language. It was a lived condition of consciousness, where existence flowed without fear, hierarchy, or separation from the divine source. This knowledge was never meant for crowds. It was passed quietly, because those who controlled the system understood one thing: memory is more dangerous than rebellion. If humanity remembered what life was like before containment, control would dissolve instantly. Jesus did not introduce new beliefs. He reminded the chosen ones of something ancient, something buried beneath layers of rewritten history. When he spoke of the kingdom of God being within, he was not offering hope for the future, but pointing to a past state that could be restored. This introduction is not meant to convince you, but to awaken recognition. If something in you feels stirred, it is not coincidence. Jesus taught that truth does not enter through logic alone, but through remembrance. The Archons hid the Pre-Adamic truths because they revealed that the current world order is not natural. It is constructed, and anything constructed can collapse the moment its foundations are exposed. As this journey begins, release what you were told to believe and allow yourself to remember what was taken. The story does not start with Adam. That was the beginning of something else entirely. Truth 1. Life existed before the fall. Jesus revealed the first and most foundational pre-Adamic truth. Life existed before the fall, and it existed in harmony, not in chaos, not in rebellion, and not in darkness. The fall was never humanity's origin story, but its entry into limitation. Before Adam, consciousness was unified. There was no separation between spirit and existence, no struggle between survival and meaning. Life functioned as direct participation with the divine source, without intermediaries, laws, or imposed authority. Jesus taught that this state was not lost through disobedience, but interrupted through interference. The Archons reframed the pre-Adamic world as myth, because acknowledging it exposes the artificial nature of the current system. If life once existed without fear, then fear is not natural. If existence once flowed without hierarchy, then domination is learned, not inherent. Adam represents the moment humanity was placed inside structure, time, and control. This is why Jesus spoke so often about returning, not advancing. His teachings were filled with language of restoration, remembrance, and awakening. When he said the meek would inherit the earth, he was referring to those who refuse domination because they remember a world without it. This truth explains why humanity instinctively resists control, even when conditioned to accept it. It explains why rules feel heavy to the soul and why freedom feels familiar, even when never experienced consciously. The pre-Adamic state was not perfect because it was static, but because it was aligned. Jesus taught that the fall introduced fragmentation, dividing consciousness into observer and observed, ruler and ruled. This division became the foundation of all later systems. The Archons hid this truth because it reveals that the current world is not the original design. It is a deviation, and deviations require enforcement to survive. Truth 2. Death was introduced, not inevitable. The second pre-Adamic truth Jesus revealed was even more threatening to the system. Death was not part of original life. In the beginning, existence was continuous. Consciousness did not experience itself as severed, reset, or erased. Change occurred, but annihilation did not. Jesus taught that death was introduced as a mechanism, not a destiny, a tool designed to generate fear, obedience, and dependency. Once beings believe they end, they can be controlled through survival anxiety. The Archons embedded death into the human experience and then normalized it through culture, religion, and biology itself. Jesus' teachings on eternal life were never meant as distant rewards after obedience, but as reminders of a previous state of being. When he said those who believe would never truly die, he was pointing to continuity of consciousness, not physical immortality in its current form. The fear of death became the most effective control system ever created. It forces compliance, justifies violence, and makes domination appear necessary. Jesus consistently dismantled this fear, showing that death had no authority over awakened consciousness. This is why his message was so dangerous. A human who does not fear death cannot be ruled. The Archons hid this truth by reframing death as natural, even sacred. But Jesus taught that what is natural does not require fear to enforce acceptance. The normalization of death was the normalization of control. By remembering that death was introduced, not inherent, humanity begins to reclaim sovereignty over its own existence. This truth does not deny physical transition, but exposes the lie of finality. Jesus taught that life continues because it always did. Death was never the end. It was the beginning of forgetting. Truth 3. Humanity was sovereign. 3. 80400 words. The third pre-Adamic truth Jesus taught was the most subversive of all. Humanity was sovereign. Before Adam, before law, before worship as obligation, conscious beings existed without masters. There were no ruling gods demanding submission, no intermediaries standing between life and the divine source. Authority did not exist because it was unnecessary. Jesus revealed that sovereignty was humanity's original condition, and obedience was introduced later as a replacement. The Archons understood that sovereignty makes control impossible, so they inverted reality by redefining submission as virtue. Jesus rejected this inversion repeatedly. He refused titles, power, and hierarchy, because they mirrored the very system that removed humanity from its original state. When he washed feet instead of ruling, he was demonstrating the pre-Adamic order, where dominance had no place. Sovereignty meant responsibility without coercion, freedom without rebellion. Humanity did not need permission to exist or intermediaries to connect with the divine. Jesus taught that the moment authority was externalized, humanity forgot its own capacity to sub. This is why his message threatened religious institutions more than political ones. A sovereign being does not require priests, rulers, or saviors. The Archons replaced sovereignty with dependence, teaching humanity that it was broken, sinful, and in need of constant correction. Jesus dismantled this lie by reminding the chosen ones that the divine was not above them, but within them. Sovereignty was reframed as arrogance, and obedience as humility. But Jesus showed that true humility is alignment with truth, not submission to control. This truth explains why power structures instinctively resist awakened individuals. A sovereign human cannot be ruled, only the saved. The Archons hid this truth because once sovereignty is remembered, authority collapses. Jesus did not come to claim dominion, but to return it. How the Archons rewrote reality, 380 to 400 words. After removing humanity from its pre-Adamic state, the Archons faced a problem. Memory. As long as humanity remembered what it was, control would be temporary. Jesus taught that the solution was not force alone, but narrative. Reality was rewritten through symbols, stories, and repeated conditioning. The pre-Adamic world was reframed as fantasy. Sovereignty became rebellion. Death became sacred. Obedience became salvation. Over generations, these inversions solidified into culture, religion, and identity. Jesus understood that most humans were not imprisoned by chains, but by stories they accepted as truth. This is why he taught in parables. He spoke beneath the surface language, planting seeds that could bypass conditioning. The Archons encoded control into time itself, creating linear history that begins with Adam and ends with judgment. Anything before Adam was erased, dismissed, or myth. Jesus warned that those who control the story control perception. Once perception is shaped, behavior follows naturally. The Archons hid behind gods, laws, and moral frameworks. To legitimize their rule, Jesus exposed this by breaking religious rules, healing without permission, and speaking directly to the people. He showed that authority loses power when questioned calmly. The rewriting of reality was so complete that humanity began defending the very systems that enslaved it. Jesus taught that awakening would feel like betrayal at first, because it contradicts everything learned. This chapter reveals that the prison is not physical. It is conceptual, and concepts can be dismantled, the moment they are seen for what they are. The Archons' greatest success was convincing humanity that this world is the only one that ever existed. Jesus and the strategy of remembrance, 380 to 400 words. Jesus' true strategy was not confrontation, but remembrance. He understood that directly opposing the Archons would strengthen their control, because resistance keeps attention focused on the system. Instead, he taught people to remember what they were before the system existed. Remembrance dissolves control without conflict. This is why Jesus often withdrew, remained silent, or responded indirectly. He was not avoiding danger. He was avoiding reinforcement of the illusion. Jesus taught that awakening is passive in appearance, but absolute in effect. When memory returns, fear loses authority. When fear dissolves, obedience becomes unnecessary. Jesus' miracles were not displays of power, but demonstrations of alignment. They showed what life looks like when sovereignty, continuity, and harmony are restored, even briefly. The Archons tolerated him until remembrance spread too far. Once people began realizing they were not broken, the system responded. The crucifixion was not the end of his mission, but the attempt to freeze it into symbolism. By turning Jesus into an object of worship, his teachings were neutralized. Memory was replaced with belief. Jesus taught that belief is fragile, but remembrance is permanent. This chapter closes by restoring his original intent, not to be followed, but remembered, not to be worshipped, but understood. The pre-Adamic truths were never meant to create followers, but free beings. Jesus did not come to change the world. He came to remind humanity that the world had already been changed, and that remembering was the way back. The false salvation and the inverted message, Jesus warned that after remembrance begins, the system responds with inversion. When truth cannot be erased, it is rebranded. This is exactly what happened to his teachings. The Archons did not destroy Jesus' message directly. They preserved the shell and removed the core. Salvation was redefined as obedience. Liberation was postponed into the afterlife. Remembrance was replaced with belief. Jesus taught that the kingdom was present, but institutions taught it was distant. He spoke of inner authority, but systems taught external mediation. This inversion was not accidental. Jesus understood that a message of sovereignty cannot coexist with centralized power. By transforming his teachings into doctrine, the system ensured dependence would continue. People were taught to wait, to hope, to submit, rather than to remember. Jesus' warnings about false shepherds were not metaphors. They were precise descriptions of how control would persist under spiritual language. The Archons needed humanity to believe it was saved while remaining contained. This chapter reveals how the cross became a symbol that replaced the message behind it. Jesus' life was reduced to an event rather than a living example. His words were quoted without context, stripped of their pre-Adamic foundation. Yet fragments remained. His insistence on truth, freedom, and inner light could not be fully erased. Jesus taught that awakening would come in cycles, whenever remembrance resurfaced, despite suppression. This chapter reconnects the viewer to the realization that salvation was never something Jesus gave, but something he pointed back to. The inversion succeeded only because humanity forgot at once, lived without needing to be rescued. Why remembrance is happening again now. Jesus taught that remembrance returns when control reaches its peak. When systems become too rigid, too artificial, consciousness begins to reject them instinctively. This is why many feel a growing sense of dissonance with modern life. The acceleration of fear, division, and distraction is not a coincidence. It is a sign of instability within the controlled structure itself. Jesus said that when the old world tightens its grip, memory leaks through the cracks. Technology, information, and global awareness have unintentionally weakened narrative control. The Archons no longer fully dictate what can be known. Jesus taught that remembrance does not arrive dramatically, but quietly. It begins as discomfort, as questions that refuse to disappear. This chapter explains why people feel called to ancient knowledge now, why pre-Adamic concepts resonate without explanation. T is not learning. It is recognition. Jesus described awakening as remembering a dream you did not know you had forgotten. The system labels this confusion, rebellion, or delusion, because it cannot allow remembrance to be normalized. But Jesus taught that truth does not need permission to surface. The pre-Adamic memory returns because it was never destroyed, only suppressed. This chapter brings the viewer to the edge of realization. If these truths feel familiar, it is because they are. Jesus said that those with ears to hear would recognize his voice, not because it was loud, but because it echoed something already within them. Remembering is the escape. 380 to 400 words. The story does not end with Adam, and it does not end with Jesus. It ends with remembrance. Jesus taught that humanity's captivity was never physical, but forgetful. The Pre-Adamic truths were hidden not to punish humanity, but to control it. A being that forgets its origin can be shaped into anything. Jesus came to interrupt that process. He did not offer a new destination, but pointed back to an original state. Life before Adam was not perfect because it was idealized, but because it was aligned. Death had no authority. Sovereignty was natural. Fear was unnecessary. The Archons built a world that depends on forgetting these facts. But forgetting is not permanent. Jesus taught that memory returns when the soul is ready, not when permission is given. This is why his message continues to surface, despite centuries of suppression. Remembering does not require rebellion, rituals, or leaders. It requires honesty. The honesty to admit that something in this world feels wrong because it is not original. Jesus said the truth would set you free, not because it adds something to you, but because it removes what was placed on you. The pre-Adamic truths are not a belief system. They are a recall sequence. As this video ends, understand this clearly. Escape is not an action. It is a recognition. You do not leave the system by fighting it. You leave it by outgrowing it. Jesus taught that when remembrance returns, the system collapses naturally because it was never built on truth to begin with. If this message resonates, subscribe to continue this journey. Like and share so this truth reaches those who are ready. Comment, I remember to anchor this knowledge within yourself.